lesson. This is the phylum Echinoderms, and you see here we were holding two sea urchins. The beaver is about to eat these two echinoderms. Echinoderms are basically the closest related to humans, the closest invertebrates. Look where they are. We're almost at the end of our branching system. Here's chordates, and we'll be part of the chordate group. And so notice that basically the difference between us and the last group that we studied, but all mollusks, annelids, and arthropods are protostone development. So remember, protostone is the way in which the cells divide during development, and what makes the mouth and the anus in different direction than the Deuterostones. So echinoderms are Deuterostones. They're coelomates, obviously, and they also have radial symmetry. So this is interesting. Remember that radial symmetry was something that existed way back here in our diagram, and then bilateral symmetry became something that is more advanced in terms of evolutionary time. Now, notice this, that even though this is in the bilateral symmetry section, these are radial symmetric. Well, that's because they're radial symmetric at some point in their lives. Most of the time, they become radially symmetric during adulthood, but their larvae are still bilateral. So that's why they're still under the bilateral symmetry. So what does this mean? All right, so that means that if they were bilateral, if they're bilateral when they are at the larval stage, they evolved into bilateral organisms and then became radial symmetric through a derived trait, because remember, they're way past the radial symmetry. So this is a new thing for them. And the way that we know that is because they're babies. When they're babies, they're not radially symmetric. So that's how we know it's a derived trait. Remember, derived trait is a trait that is more recent, that developed more recent. Okay. The groups that you find under this are Seastars and brittle stars. So here's a sea star. This is a sea star, also called the crown of thorns sea star, and this is a brittle star. And even though they are similar looking, they're actually in different groups. There's also sea urchins and sea urchins. In this group, we also have sand dollars and sea biscuits. And we also have this organism called crinoids. So these crinoids are not really common anymore. They're only found in a few places in the ocean, but they used to be a common organism found in our historical Earth. And last but not least, sea cucumbers. Very interesting and bizarre organisms. This is called a chocolate chip cucumber right here. Okay, so some of the characteristics that echinoderms have is they have spiny skins, and if they don't have an actual like spines protruding like this, they have like a bumpy or kind of a hardened type of outside, kind of like a hedgehog if you think about it. It's if you think about it, it's a hybrid between an endoskeleton and an exoskeleton, because it does protect them on the outside and it protects them on the inside. They also have a very interesting way in which they move, and they take in oxygen. So this is the internal organs of a sea star, and you notice that it has this, you don't need to know the actual parts, the names, but you need to know how the sea star works. So you have this madreporite here, which is how the sea star brings the water into its location, and then it fills these tube feet and the ampullae with water. And then the ampullae and the tube feet that you see here will swell up with water, and then it will actually release the water and shrink the water, release the water, and then when they shrink, they're able to build some suction at the bottom of their little tubular feet. These tubular feet actually also help them in feeding in many of them, that you will see that in just a moment. If you notice here in this animation, you can see how the tubular feet are actually working. You don't see the internal water coming in, but you see how they are moving and attaching. Okay, another interesting feature that they have is that they have very interesting varieties of feeding. In this example here, the sea star actually is, this thing that you see here is its stomach, and what it's going to do to this clam is it's going to take the stomach out of its body. It's going to throw the stomach on top of this food, and it's going to bring it in and help digest it. So it actually has like an external stomach movement that throws up the stomach. The next thing that I want to show you, another eating strategy here, is these are the little teeth in a sand dollar. If you crack a sand dollar open, you will see the little teeth. And then I'm going to show you the eating strategy of a sea urchin.
Urchins are grazers, munching their way through submarine pastures of plants and algae, and they do it in slow motion. Along the California coast, urchins can reach plague proportions. They have a voracious appetite for giant kelp. These emerald forests, lush citadels of life, are defenseless before the slow and steady urchin army. Seen in time-lapse, urchins spring into eerie life, devouring anything edible in their path.
I'm going to fast forward this a little so we have enough time so that you can see what I'm talking about, how it captures the food.
The feet act like a bucket brigade, passing the food from one sticky sucker to the next, pulling the meal relentlessly toward the powerful, star-shaped jaw that awaits underneath.
That's its jaw.
The sheer force of its 5 razor-sharp teeth can shatter a grain of sand. It makes short work of the tender kelp, neatly scissoring it into bite-sized pieces.
So pretty neat how it eats. Okay, and so our next, so this is a sea cucumber, and sea cucumber, they're actually filter feeders, and you see it uses its little tentacles to bring remnants of kelp and other types of plant material, and basically licks its arms with these, absorbing these pieces. Okay, another interesting feature is that many of these organisms in the Echinoderm family regenerate, and this also, I think we talked about the sea star, breaks off arms and they grow back out. This is a sea cucumber, and this is its stomach, and it actually throws up the stomach when it feels threatened, and the stomach, hoping that the predator will eat the stomach and leave the actual sea cucumber alone, and then it will regenerate its stomach. Okay, another interesting feature is is about sea cucumbers, and they have very, very bizarre organisms. They have the most amazing butts. And the reason why they have this is because they have the anus, if you see here, it has this tube that actually absorbs all the water. And you notice these organs here, these are its lungs. They actually are like very similar to our lungs, but more primitive. And so it brings water through the anus, absorbs all the oxygen that it needs, and releases the water back out. So they actually breathe through their anus. Okay, now let's talk about the phylum Chordata for invertebrates. So that we're now in the last section here. So we're going to talk about chordate invertebrates, and there's also chordate vertebrates, which is us humans. But we're going to talk about some general things about chordates. So we're coelomates, we're Deuterostones, just like the echinoderms. And we have there are four major characteristics that are known in this group. So the first thing is a notochord. A notochord is a flexible rod-like structure that is used for support. You see it here. This notochord will become in vertebrates, will become your vertebrae. So it will become your spinal column, and it will become your bones, right? But when you are invertebrate, it just stays like a flexible rod that gives it more structure, but flexibility. So they can't really break a bone because there are no bones. It's more like cartilage that gives it more structure, but at the same time, it has a lot of flexibility. So this is one of the characteristics that our chordate has, a notochord. The second one is called the post-anal tail. So as you guys know, we have a tailbone, humans do, but we used to have a tail, but the tail is gone. So now we just call it the tailbone. It's a little protrusion. But for other organisms that still have a tail, it's called the post-anal tail. And the reason why this is important is, you say probably many organisms have tails. What is the big deal? Notice it says post. So this post is for posterior. Do you remember posterior means rear and anterior means front? This is the first time in evolution that the tail is actually in the posterior, in the bottom of the organism. So these tails still help for movement. The next one is the dorsal hollow nerve cord, and this basically is what will develop into the nervous system. Now the anterior end in here is where the brain, it will develop the brain, and the posterior is where the spinal cord will develop. In invertebrates that are not chordates, the nervous system is actually in the ventral part. Remember, ventral means front of the digestive system. But in chordates, it's actually in the dorsal part. So it's in the back of the organism as opposed to on the front. Okay. The next thing that we're gonna, the fourth characteristic that is important that these organisms have is called the pharyngeal slits. Now, the pharyngeal slits, you have a pharynx that allows you to, after you chew your food, it allows you to process the food down. These pharyngeal slits actually will become gills in some organisms, and that's probably our pharynx was where our gills used to be before evolution. But they can actually help filter feeding, gas exchange, or any other function that are like those. Okay, so these invertebrate chordates, what are they? They're lancelets and tunicates. Lancelets live at the bottom of the ocean, so you probably have not seen them. They spend most of their time filter feeding, and they bury themselves in the ground quite often. Tunicates, you might have seen it, but you might have not known that you have seen a tunicate. They're actually sessile during adult life, and you would know that it's a tunicate